From Microbe TV, this is Matters Microbial, a podcast about the wonders of microbiology, microbiologists, and microbial centrism. This episode was recorded on June 6th, 2024. Hello, Micronauts, and welcome once again to today's Quality Quorum. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Martin, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Today is the 44th episode of Matters Microbial. Those of you who watch and/or listen and spread the good microbial word to others, many, many thanks. I really appreciate it. Summer research with my Doc Martians has been fun and educational for all of us. One of my students found an agar-degrading bacterium that's pigmented, as seen here. She calls her isolates her personal pit crew. In screening various marine water samples, we find that luminous colonies occur in some locations and not in others, but they're always beautiful like starry skies, as seen here. Several times on this podcast, we've discussed the value of mentorship. I have had good mentors and not so good mentors, and I've done my best to be a good mentor. And I am grateful to the mentors who made a big difference in my microbiological life. This microbial portrait is of two of my microbial heroes, now sadly passed away, Abigail Salyers and Edward Ledbetter. They were directors of the Woods Hole Microbial Diversity course I took many years ago. This course was utterly transformative to my teaching and my research. I've included a link to this course in the show notes. I just wish I could take it again, to be honest, even after all these years. Both Abigail and Ed believed in me and were wholly admirable microbiologists and human beings. I am putting a link to little biographies of each of them in the show notes. Please take a moment and read about Ed and especially Abigail. You will not be sorry. My own background in microbiology has been environmental and marine. Yet, when most people think of microbiology, their minds go to medically relevant microbes. So, I am honored to have a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Kimberly Walker of the University of Delaware, join us today to discuss her very interesting path in microbiology, ranging from pathogenic microbes to working in Congress to directing a program for medical diagnostics. Welcome to our Quality Quorum for today, Kim. It's great to see you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So I think something that we probably need to talk about first is how all of this started for you. How did you end up being interested in microbiology?
I took a micro course in high school. It was an elective, and I was gone right after that. That was it.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it? I mean, that one key in the lock, as it were.
Yeah, I think my senior year I took 3 science courses, and one of them was micro, and that was it.
Yeah. And so that actually started you on your path. And that's interesting because you went on from there and you were fortunate enough to do I should back up. Did you do any research as an undergraduate?
No. I worked in the summers. I was a scholarship student.
See, this is really important for people to hear. We've had a number of people with different kinds of paths. And so sometimes you'll hear people, and sometimes I'm guilty of this, thinking that the only path is by doing, say, summer research, but that all depends on your financial security, of course.
Exactly.
And, that was something that I guess I need to, give a thanks to my parents for allowing me to learn a little bit about. So in any event, then you decided to go to graduate school.
Well, the actual reason why I went to graduate school, I knew I was going to do it eventually, but I did it much sooner than I expected because when I worked in the clinical lab, I had a crappy schedule. And I would work from 3 to 11 Monday and Friday and 11 to 7 Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And one day at 3 o'clock in the morning, having stuck somebody and had to come back and run all the labs on them, I thought, if I were in school, I could be asleep right now. So that's what pushed me towards the graduate program.
But what's interesting is that I will run into students all the time that ask me about jobs in like diagnostics, working, say, in hospitals or in various labs for that purpose. And I've never told them that the hours can be a little bit challenging. So that's something that I need to bring up clearly. Would you
Well,
agree with
you
that?
can work any hours, any days, any place. Every place has a hospital. So I consider that the best career people have never heard of. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just so happened that I was new, so I got the crappy schedule. In another year, I probably would have had a better schedule, but I decided not to wait.
Kim, you were kind enough to send me some links to things about these kinds of careers, and I'm going to put them in the show notes as well.
Right.
I'm entropically challenged, not as young as I used to be, and I learned a lot from looking at those websites. So I hope others do as well. So thank you.
You're welcome. Like I said, this is the best career nobody's ever heard of. I would love to spread the word.
And it's an important one as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've asked my students when this was especially an issue when it came to talking about the pandemic. And I would say, what do you think happens to those samples? And they would kind of look at me, like a golden retriever sometimes, because they hadn't thought about it any more than I would have normally. And then you think there are all these people behind it that are doing all of that important work.
And we just graduated a class, and I've only been here at Delaware since 2022. I came in the spring of 2022. And so this is my first class that I've been with them the whole time they've been with us. And it's still just as hard as it was when I was a student. It's still just as hard as it was when I was teaching in other places. And these kids are just fabulous. They work their heart out for you. They are definitely part of the healthcare team, but they're the one nobody knows.
Well, we're going to change that today.
I agree.
Well, it's really important, and I want to hear more about that. And we will talk about, because you're a director, and I love the fact that you're a director of medical diagnostics, by the way. I feel like I should call you Director Walker now.
No, that's okay. For old friends like you, Kim is just fine.
Well, yeah, it's fun. I like the idea. So by the way, my wife, you remember Jenny, is now executive director of something. And so I've been calling her I've been calling her director at home.
I'm sure she loves that.
I think she does to some degree, to be honest with you.
That's great.
Yeah. So, you decided to go to graduate school to get some sleep, is what you said. And I can't blame you for that.
Partially. So when I first came out of school, I was trying to decide whether I was going to be a specialist in blood banking or get a degree in micro. They both require the same kind of thought pattern. So you'll find lots of students are either blood bank or micro or heme chemistry. Now, heme chemistry is more employable, but to be a specialist in blood banking is fine. And when it really came down to it, specialist in blood banking is not another degree. And so I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to get more letters. And so that's what really pushed me towards micro.
And so who did you work with? This brings us to mentorship, I believe.
Yes, my graduate advisor was Allison Weiss. We worked on Bordetella pertussis, and I worked on the dermonecrotic toxin, which it turns out doesn't do anything. So I get lots of laughs from the pertussis community, although I did go to a meeting at ASM last year, and I walked in. I didn't know the person who was talking. It was a completely different group. It wasn't associated with any of us. And I heard one of them poke the other one and said, "That's Walker. She did the DNT toxin." It's the first time I've ever felt famous.
Well, you're famous to me, so that's good. And your PhD advisor, I interacted a little bit with in graduate school. She was over in the med school at Stanford, and she was just a super person. And apparently you found, speaking of mentorship, that she was a fine mentor to you.
Absolutely. She was the best. She sort of spoiled me for many others after that. And I'm still in touch with her, and the people that we were in lab together, we're still in touch. The the scientist before me, who graduated like the year and a half before me, she went to UDel, and I used to tease her all the time because I went to Maryland, and I called her fighting blue chickens or something like that because of being here. And now I'm here, so I just have to shut up and take it from her.
It always comes around that way, doesn't it?
It does.
My late brother used to say that God is Jack Nicholson, and that would explain an awful lot. But there we go.
It would. It really would.
So I think that that's a wonderful story. I especially like the fact that, and this used to happen to me, that I would have this exciting thing I was looking at in the lab that only I cared about. And then sometimes that comes around, and then you become famous later, as you just described, which is wonderful.
That was fun. That was the most fun thing I think that's ever happened to me at the microbe meeting.
I had something where I got recognized at the Microbiology Museum in Amsterdam, Microbial. And
really?
And yeah, and just because I yap a lot on social media, and that was very strange to be recognized. But of course I'm the guy with the tattoos. That's what they recognized me for. So
that's
there you
funny.
go. Yeah.
Well, at least it was for my work, so that was fun.
Yes. And from time to time, that would happen with me because in graduate school, I developed a generalized transducing bacteriophage for the soil bacterium I did my PhD work on, and lots of labs used it. And I spent a lot of time telling myself it was no big deal and being a sad sack. This is no surprise to you. But in fact, all of those people really appreciated it, and I didn't know how to take a compliment for it. So
that is a big deal.
It was. So I think that's, and then what do you do after your PhD? I mean, if you're me, you do a couple of postdoctoral stints, and then I went into a biotech industry for a while, and so on and so forth, like a pachinko ball, ended up here. And your own path?
So I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Vaccine Development with Jim Notaro, and we worked on diarrheagenic E. coli. So I went from Bordetella to E. coli and Salmonella and Shigella. After that, Bob Bielis's lab with Proteus mirabilis. I'm still kind of working with Proteus mirabilis with my students. And then finally, I don't know if you would even call this a postdoc, but I was at Morgan State with Henry Williams, and that's where I met you because we were working on Bedella vibrio. It was even before it was Bedella vibrio and like organisms. It was just Bedella vibrio then.
Henry is a fabulous person, isn't he?
He is probably the best mentor in the world. He mentors you even if you don't want it. And the funny thing about it is, even at my advanced age, I still talk to Henry about decisions I'm going to make. And the one time I didn't talk it over with him, it blew up in my face. So always talk to Henry if you can.
I think you need a button that says that. And I can really, even though I never worked with Henry, I certainly spoke with him at many meetings, and he had, I would honestly say, a characteristic that you have of complete calm. And
yeah,
he might
Henry's
be very different.
Calm.
Yeah, and you give that appearance as well. I'm not saying how you act away, but it's just a very calming person to talk with, and it really helps you explain what you're thinking. I've had lots of people that are kind of like me, and they're all over the place, and it's kind of hard to talk with them a little bit. So you really do need a mentor that fits you, whatever that might be. And so that's what you found with Henry, and certainly with Allison. And Henry, fabulous guy.
Yeah, with Henry, it's very funny because I met him the very first time I went to the ASM general meeting. It wasn't even microbe then. So I was a graduate student, and I was up for a fellowship award, which I eventually won. ASM doesn't have it anymore, but I went to what used to be called the Black Microbiologist Mixer. It wasn't even minority, it was just us. And somehow they figured out how to get some money. It took a while for ASM to take over the cost of that. but they managed to get some money, I think, from Procter and Gamble. And maybe there were 18 or 25 people there, and Henry was one of them. I sat down and I talked to him. I talked to a bunch of other people, which turned out to be the selection committee. So sometimes if you think you should go, because you never know who you'll meet. And so he doesn't even remember that. He remembers like some other meeting where we met like 8 years later. I'm like, nope. First time, I think I was 22 or 23. I was just finishing my first year in graduate school, I think. So we've known each other for a very long time.
Yeah, he has been very kind to me. And one of the things I want to say this very carefully. I'm not known for my political acumen, so I want to say this very carefully. Some people in the area of microbiology of which we speak don't get along very well. And Henry was a person who I really wanted to emulate, because from where I sat, he got along with everybody. And I thought, that's the kind of scientist I wanted to be. I never told him that's how I felt, but I think,
I'm
when
sure
you
he'd
first
appreciate it.
It is absolutely true, because I'm sure people that I knew that were like very aggressive about their science, and it never fit well with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was wonderful to see some people. I mean, we talk a lot about, different faces, or I do, different faces and voices and styles. And many people think that all scientists are X, and they're not.
No.
And finding your group, a group of people with whom you feel you have common cause and you share things with, is really important.
It really is. And the other thing you can say about Henry, he is very calm. He's also unbelievably smart, but he does this in a folksy way. He has a very folksy North Carolina way. He reminds me a little bit of Andy Griffith. He just goes along, and then all of a sudden, bam, right in the middle of the forehead with the intelligence. It's like, wow. You think you're listening to a story, and all of a sudden, it's something completely different.
He's just waiting for everyone to catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But
he's nice about it.
Yeah, he's been claiming to retire for a couple of years. He might actually do it, in which case I will spend more time bothering him.
But you've been very fortunate about these. Now, how did all of these experiences translate to your interest in policy?
I think I've always been quite political as a scientist, and then what I found out was I was really more interested in policy than politics. But there was a AAAS fellowship available, and that still happens. So if you go to AAAS.org, you can see that fellowship. Some are in the executive agencies, some are in Congress. I happen to be in Congress, and it so happens that Henry actually had one of those fellowships when he began. And so he started to talk to me about it, and he thought, that might be good. You should try that. And so I wound up competing for and getting it, which I'm very surprised. For the congressional fellowships, I think there were 100 of us. Or no, the whole thing, there was 100 of us that year. That was 2000. So I wound up in the personal office of Paul Wellstone. I should probably send you the picture of us together. And spent a year there, which was really fun because, as a rule, members of Congress, members of the Senate are not very scientifically formulated, I would say. They took rocks for jocks. There are a bunch of lawyers. And in my case, my senator had a PhD in poli-sci. So that wasn't really science. He was lucky. He had several scientists actually working there. We had a couple of, I think we had 2 MDs, and one of the MDs was an MD JD. So when I was there, I handled pretty much all of the science and a little bit of the disability issues. So that was my portfolio. Got to meet lots and lots of people, got to realize that people who work in the Senate are crazy, and their bosses are even more crazy, which was fun. And at the end of that year, I went on to my first teaching position.
That is just, I'm always fascinated by this. this whole business. We had Joe Handelsman on the podcast who worked in the Obama White House,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the stories that she told were just remarkable. I can't imagine, actually talking to politicians that way, because truthfully, it's easy for me to try and quote Mark Twain about what he said about Congress critters and all the rest. But the fact is, I would be a little bit taken aback by these people who were really part of the wheels of governance. I would probably be surprisingly quiet. So I'm
Well, you
delighted
think that until you meet them. So, for example, I can tell this story. He's gone. He can't yell at me or anything. But for some reason, my senator would always be walking, looking in the opposite direction. So he used to bang into me all the time. So I used to have to learn how to move myself so I wouldn't get smacked in the boob, which is usually what happened. Also, when he
yeah.
came in to meet with people, he would slam the door wide open. So if you're sitting in the wrong place, you get hit with the door. After a while, you stop being so concerned that this person is a senator and try not to get a black eye. So, you don't spend that much time with the member in the Senate. You probably do more in the House because they're much smaller offices. But, there were plenty of times when it was just me and him, and we'd have a conversation about something. But when it came to scientific ideas, he didn't think anything that I didn't put in his head because he just wasn't prepared for that. And that's an awesome responsibility for the people who do it all the time. So a AAAS fellow is only a year long. But for those people who work all the time, you really have to stay on top of everything. It was great. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it well enough to go back into a policy position later on. But that was probably the best year I ever had. Everybody in the office was working for people. Even the politicians I thought I didn't like on TV, I really liked them in real life. You would talk to them and realize, okay, I understand why he thinks this. He's wrong, but at least I understand why he thinks it.
I have to tell you, I wish we had that ability in a more widespread way, because I can't help but, and I would say this is a negative, that politicians are just people, but it's actually kind of a positive. Mm-hmm. Because we simplify and we create all these fictions about people that we've never actually met. Mm-hmm. And you had, and so you got to see what they were really like, and that's interesting.
I'll tell you the best story that ever happened to me when I was on the Hill. For some reason, either from a distance, I looked like somebody he liked, or I don't know what it was. Jesse Helms absolutely loved me. He would be waving like a crazy man whenever he would see me, if I was on the train or walking towards the train. His office wasn't in the same building as our office, so I didn't see him very much, but he just absolutely loved me, which I found hysterical.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Because I'm of an age to remember Jesse Helms. So there you go.
In his
but
little
that's good,
scooter,
right?
And he would just be, hey, how are you? And then when he'd get close, he'd not say anything because I guess he realized I wasn't the person he thought I was. But thank goodness one of the interns in the office was with me one day. She's like, who's that guy? I'm like, listen, I'll tell you later.
Well, that's a really interesting thing. And I would argue in some degree, moving on to a teaching position is kind of similar to what you were doing with your senator.
No.
Okay.
Students actually sometimes come prepared. So the preparation for the Senate office, you have to write a brief every night. And basically what it has to say is, this is the problem. This is what we think our solution might be. This is why we care. This is what's going to happen. In this case, it was people in Minnesota because he was from Minnesota. So how this affects Minnesota. And because of him being quite liberal, this is how it's going to affect the working class. This is how it's, so that was his focus. That's a little bit different than trying to make sure that they wind up with all of the information that they need to pass the certification exam that every MLS student has to pass before they can practice. So, Yeah, it was very different. To me it was easier.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. Uh, I remember when I was younger, I was thinking, well, maybe I could have an impact at a higher level. Well, I don't really know about that. I'm kind of happy doing what I've done. I think that works out better for me.
I don't know, you've
But
taught for a long time. I'd say you've had a lot of impact.
oh, that's nice of you to say. Thank you.
I
So
still
you went
see.
on, and I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say. So then you took some teaching positions after that.
hmm So I taught at my alma mater, which is the University of Maryland at Baltimore, in the same program that I got my medical technology degree. It's now called MLS. After all those postdocs, and I went to school in Richmond, and so I found myself back in Baltimore, which is also not my hometown, and taught there for about 10 years. And then an opening came at ASM to do policy for them. And I thought, well, I better do it now before I get too old, because policy is really a young person's game. So if you walk into a House office or a Senate office, you'd be surprised at how young everybody is. They're either fresh out of college, fresh out of their master's. Maybe if you're high enough on the totem pole, you might be in your 40s. But it's quite a young person's game. It also doesn't pay very well, but if you work, in the Senate or in the House, there's a reason why you see revolving door of people going into industry and making more money. It's the kind of place that you certainly need a second salary, but ASM paid well enough that I could actually live alone and do policy on clinical laboratories, which is
Oh,
mostly what I did.
that must be really important.
Well, it is. As a matter of fact, right now we're in the middle of a big fight with the FDA, mostly because they want to regulate laboratory developed tests, which is you make this test from different pieces because there isn't a test that you need that's on the market. So depending on what they call a laboratory developed test. It can be as simple as I open this wash from a different kit and I'm using it on this test. That's a laboratory developed test. Or what we had with COVID, those were all laboratory developed tests because of course there was no test on the market. So every lab had to do it themselves. Now the FDA has decided that they need to have control over all of those, and every one of those laboratory tests, developed tests, has to be worked up the same way as one that would be on the market. So literally, this is going to stop hospitals from running certain tests. There's no other way around it because even the largest possible hospitals, say something associated with a medical school like UNC or UCLA or Yale, it where there is a lot of research going on, to actually have the FDA come in and check them like they would a real industry where they would make these tests is going to cost a fortune and no one's going to do it. So they have had their final rule out, and believe it or not, there are a number of Republican senators and House members who don't want to see this. Now, I think their idea is that they don't want regulation, but the lab community is starting to get on top of it as well because we don't want that either.
I mean, this is one of the things that people don't think about. When I recently took an antigen test, which I had to do before this procedure, and I was just thinking, where are these pieces from? Who puts these together? And there used to be a book. Do you remember the book The Way Things Work?
I don't think so.
It's a wonderful picture book, but
hmm
it's got lots of words in it, don't worry, about how everyday things work. And I found it fascinating, like how does a toaster work? So they
hmm
had diagrams of what was inside and how they worked. And in a similar way, when I see something new, I think, how was that put together? I don't necessarily mean the mechanics of assembling a kit and putting all the pieces in a box, but how do you put all those things together? And I could see how someone could say we want some regulation on those things because of this particular fear here.
hmm
What I worry about is that people don't think about the costs of changing what's being done over here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why having people like yourself or lab professionals involved in that kind of decision making is important. And my big fear is that this is a decision made by people that have never touched a kit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is why everybody in the clinical lab knew that Elizabeth Holmes was lying years before everybody else did. Every single one of us went, well, she can't do that. That's impossible. That won't work. And that's also why
No,
she kept any laboratory scientist out of her company, because every one of them would have said the same thing. It's not going to work.
amazing, amazing. So, I mean, that's a good example for of the kind of the intersection of policy, decision making, and actually how laboratory work is done for medical laboratory work is done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really a thing that people need to think about. I'm not trying to say for the next pandemic, but of course there will be another health crisis of one form or another.
Sure there will.
And we have to be fluid and quick in the way that we handle it.
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, everybody saw not that it would be SARS-CoV-2, but that there would be a respiratory infection that no one had any immunity to. And they did, as a matter of fact, they did the, I guess it was like a play about what should happen. And Madeleine Albright was in it. And one of the people that I was on the Hill with, who was in my fellowship class, also took part in it. I think it was at the University of Pittsburgh or something. And that is exactly the scenario that they gamed out. That this was going to be a respiratory infection, highly infectious. We have no immunity for it. What will happen next? So it's not like we don't see these things coming. And certainly there are offices that this is their job to just do it. Unfortunately, after Obama left the White House, President Trump decided that we don't need that office. We'll close that down. And then look what happened.
Yeah, and these things are going to happen in all kinds of contexts. I mean, I'm always so disturbed to have read about the influenza epidemic in 1917, and almost everything that we complain about today about how people act happened then too.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know the exact quote about history. The first time it happens is a tragedy. The second time is kind of a comedy, because that's really what we're dealing with here. We don't seem to learn. And I would love to tell you that we've learned something from this, but history suggests that we haven't.
Well, if you happen to see Tony Fauci on the Hill last week, we have less than learned something. We've gone backwards.
Mm-hmm. So fingers crossed. You know, when I took epidemiology a million years ago at UCLA, my instructor, Telford Work, was hysterical. And he used to say, epidemiologists are interesting because he did a lot of work on hemorrhagic fevers.
Okay.
But he used to say to us in the seminar class, your job as an epidemiologist is to be wrong. And I said, excuse me?
You hope, yeah.
Because that's the goal. You say, here's this terrible thing that's going to happen, and it's good news when you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's something for all of us to learn about how best to handle things. I don't have an answer, obviously. But I am going to pay attention to the people. I'm going to listen to This Week in Virology, for example, which was very helpful to me. Thank you, Vincent. But I mean, that's what I think that's why science literacy is so important, which brings us back. I agree.
I had a podcast for a couple of years, and that was our whole point, to just make sure people understand what they see. I've been known to do a Facebook Live every now and then. I was earlier this year, I guess over spring break, I was up in Harlem doing a Q&A about a lot of health-related stuff, but mostly clinical laboratory, vaccinology. I mean, I'm actually completely trained for all the stuff that happened during COVID. I can't believe it. It was like everything converged together. So my degrees in microbiology and immunology. Then I postdoced at Center for Vaccine Development, and then I did policy work. Like, if there's anybody on earth who can talk to the non-scientist about it, I think it's me.
Yeah. And my spin on you, and I might be prejudiced because I think kind of highly of you, in case you didn't know that, is that you actually had a lot of success at that, because the style in which you express yourself is clear, it's straightforward. I don't see the dancing that I sometimes see from experts, which I think that any layperson is kind of tuned. I don't trust that person. Kind of like the used car salesman thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of it is that I don't have to answer to anybody. So if I were
Yeah.
working for the federal government and the CDC, there are things I could not say. Because I don't, and this is sort of my off time, so I'm not even representing my own university. It's just that I think you have to bring it to whatever audience needs it. So in my case, most of what we did on the postdoc, on the podcast, and with the Facebook Live, I was thinking about my own family and friends who do not have the benefit of the education that I have. So, my uncle was on there asking a bunch of questions. Somebody asked me straight out, how can you tell if it's COVID or something else? I said, go take a test. Like, it's very easy. Take the they wanted something special and fun. If you could put your one foot in the water and hold it for 2 hours, then you don't have COVID. You'd be surprised at the kinds of things people see on Facebook and believe. So I just think you have to know your audience. I think I would not work for different types of audiences, but I know who these people are. I've known them all my life. They're my friends, they're my family, so I know how to talk to them. I think, if I were trying to talk to a bunch of Yale epi students, I would have to have a very different presentation. But this works for lay people who are, K through 12 educated, maybe community college, but don't clearly know what's going on in vaccinology, which I can easily tell them.
One of the things, Kim, that I tell my first year students when they take intro cell and molecular biology with me, my last time was last semester. I tell them at the conclusion of the class, you all know more than almost every member of Congress about biology.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at me like, what? And I said, it's 100% true. And I want you to remember that. I'm not telling you what to believe or why. What I am trying to say is you have information now, and it's your job to be able to talk about that information, especially when someone says something that you know not to be true,
Mm-hmm.
factually. And that seemed to work with some of them. I get a lot of non-majors in that class, and
Nice.
especially when it came to like what the tests are telling us with SARS-CoV-2 and all the rest. We talked. It was actually the best way to talk about PCR was explaining about the number of doublings, the cycle numbers,
Mm-hmm.
and that complete. Nothing else seemed to hit them that way. So I'm not going to say that it's good that we had a pandemic. I am going to say that I was able to get more people thinking critically because of that.
I agree completely. When I have to explain about tests to lay people, I always say, you remember all those COVID tests? Those are the students we train. They are the ones who do that work. And then they go, oh, sometimes you can talk about your grandma's cholesterol levels or, somebody's diabetes. And it's not quite the same intensity as when you say how many COVID tests there were. Somebody had to make them. Somebody had to run them. We have biotechs in our program. We have medtechs in our program. We got it all covered.
Well, actually, I looked over your program at Delaware, and it really looks cool. I didn't know that much about it. Now, you have an undergraduate degree essentially adjacent to medical technology.
Yes. It's called MLS now, Medical Laboratory Science. And yes, we have an undergraduate. We also have a graduate. So if people say you got your biology degree and you thought you were going to medical school, but you didn't go to medical school, you didn't get in or whatever. You can come back with that degree in micro or that degree in chemistry or that degree in biology and do our Masters of Science in MLS. That is, you go through all the areas. You are basically comped a couple of classes because of what you've already taken. You go out on rotation. You get your master's degree. You sit for the certification exam. Nobody works in the lab unless they're certified. Just like every other healthcare profession, the nurses are certified, the OTs are certified, the PTs are certified. We are certified as well. And so we have that. We also have what is called AMBI, which is basically our biotech program. You can get an undergraduate degree in that. You can also get a master's in that as well. We have our PhD program. And then we have a large number of sort of MLS related pre-med and pre-physician's assistants programs. And that's the big number. So typically we may have 30 or so MLSs, 30 or so AMBIs, and then 100 people who either want to go to medical school or PA school. And so I have a colleague, she and I both graduated from the same Maryland MLS program. She runs the pre-PA program, and it's very popular. Her students outnumber my students about 3-1. Nobody wants to go to med school anymore. They just want to be a PA. So, we have those are undergraduates as well. And then you can also do the master's either in medical science or the PhD in medical science.
Do you know what was really an advantage that you're going to have with this program that, for example, I don't have, is that when people are interested in a medical career, you have people on tap that you can bring in to talk about it.
Absolutely.
The number of times that I get students, and I adore my students. I'm not being critical, nor am I being a dad and saying they disappoint me, but they say things like, I know I want to be a physician. By the way, I have to teach them to say that instead of just saying I want to go to medical school. They want to be a physician is what they should say. And then they'll say, because I liked, and they say House or one of those other TV shows. And I said, you know what? No matter how hard they try, it's not the same. Please don't think that way. Talk to some people who actually do it for a living.
I am banned from my family watching shows like that with them because, of course, I see all the mistakes. If I see one more flask full of blue water, I'm going to lose it. What lab ever has that?
Closest I got is for the pH meter. That's the storage
once
buffer.
Upon a time, right?
Yeah. But it has nothing to do.
Purple water and blue water and yellow water, and this is the lab. I'm like, in what world is that the lab?
Yeah. It makes me sad. But, every time that, maybe this is more as you grow older, but certainly when I have to go give blood for various tests and all the rest, and there's a tech doing that, and I see on the wall their certifications and the way that they do it. And I often ask them, what was that like for you learning these things? And they all seem to love it. And as you say, employable.
Absolutely. Anywhere in the world, really. When I was in Ohio, I ran the 2-year program, the MLT program, and also the phlebotomy program. And I kind of don't like phlebotomy, how you run a program that you don't like. But they were really good. Those kids came through that program. I was more proud of them than the MLTs. They were only there for a year, but they really learned how to stick. You couldn't feel it. They were fabulous. So I'm always, that's the person that the patient sees. So even as an MLS, when I was out of school, I was sitting at the dinner table with my father who said, so you go get the blood, right? I'm like, wow. Okay. Even my own father. So I think we have to do something to make this career a little bit more visible to people because we're sort of like the back of the house of the restaurant. The cooks you don't see, the bakers, the sous chefs you don't see. You just see the waitress come out with the food. So I think, that's, like I said, this is the best career you never heard of, but we're going to try to figure out how to make sure they can hear of it.
And this particular episode will serve a little bit of that. And hopefully people will come to see that this is something worth thinking about and talking about with others.
Certainly. I hope so.
So this brings us up to date with where you're at, which is wonderful. I think you've I mean, I describe myself as a pachinko ball moving through things, but you've always moved kind of in the same direction, one way or another. And
Sort
and
of.
I look at the experiences that you've had and the skills that you've gained and the people that you've made a difference for. You must be very proud of yourself. Okay, of them and your role in helping them.
Well, actually, I feel like I haven't wasted my life, which is something that a lot of people can't say, you know?
Yeah.
So I've been happy with many of the choices I've made. Not all of them, but many of them. But I think being back with students after a 10-year break, I felt like even though, ASM was a great place, I loved working with Janet Shoemaker. She was fabulous. And I learned a lot from her with respect to policy. I felt like I was getting old. When you're not around students, you sort of get out of the whole zeitgeist of what's happening and you don't know the pop culture references or anything. I got to get back to class. So I did the 2 years in Ohio, which turned out to be very good for me, even though I didn't like Ohio. My cousin lived right down the road, so I got to spend a lot of time with him. He's since passed away, so that's time I'll never get back. So I'm really happy that I spent that 2 years there. And here I'm close to home. I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I'm in Newark, Delaware. That's about 75 miles, so I can get home and see my mother, who just celebrated her 80th birthday. So that's been good. Delaware feels very much like home. Eastern Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, they're all kind of alike. It's a little different than Ohio. It's a lot different from Virginia, but yeah, I can say I'm happy. I'll have to work a few more years than I wanted to before I could retire, but that's okay. What else am I going to do?
Right. And then I'm faced with what am I going to do? So, and because I've always worried about one thing or another, I have to tell you, I don't have it handy here, but I had a pin made for myself. I like these enamel pins. And I had one that it has, let's see if I have this right. It's get, a line, and it underneath it. And it's to remind me to get over it. The things that I worry about. And I always worry about things. And it keeps me up at night. Like before I had a job, I thought, oh, how do I get back into act? Well, at any point in my life, what's the next step? And the fact is it all did work out. And it always will.
There's a saying in Spanish, I don't know if it translates very well in English, but if there's a remedy, why worry? If there's no remedy, why worry?
That's actually very wise.
It sounds a little bit better in Spanish, but that's pretty much what it is. Worrying doesn't change anything, so why do it?
I think you're right. And I think for some people, and maybe I'm guilty of this, it's kind of like trained myself to think in that non-productive way rather than to look at the opportunities. But I'm fortunate because I have Jenny to remind me of all these things. One thing that's occurred to many people and me is that, as you say, if a lot of politicians on the Hill, and I've always wanted to say on the Hill, thank you, don't know a lot of science, how do you combat the fact that they may not know any science or maybe have pride in not knowing some science? I hate to be judgmental, but there are some people like that. How did you deal with that yourself?
Well, I never had that problem. I worked in the office of Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, and he had at least 2 MDs and a number of PhDs. That's pretty common in Senate offices. But I think most people who are elected are not happy about their ignorance. They're embarrassed by it. And so frequently they will bring on a AAAS fellow or someone along those lines. There are several programs besides that one. and they will bring on someone who helps them learn things, writes them good briefs, and explains to them what they're missing. Some people they do revel in their ignorance, and vote them out. That's the only thing you can do.
I think I really hate to say this because I don't mind read, and no one can, and it's probably a good thing. But I suspect that some people are playing to a particular block, and I have no idea what the politician actually thinks, and that kind of worries me. I don't mean to imply that about any particular person. I kind of want to know what they think, and then make my voting choices on that myself.
Well, I think a lot of that is true. They do, but the block is usually not that large. And so if all of us decided we have had enough of this, we could vote people like that out. The real problem is voter apathy. We just won't do it. We won't contribute. We won't knock on doors. We won't put out signs, and we won't vote. The first thing I did when I moved to Delaware was make sure I was registered to vote. I wasn't playing around. And I think, that's another thing along with the science literacy that we think about, is that we have to do the political literacy for people. Go to the city hall and see what the committee is doing, or show up at your state senator's fish fry or whatever it is. Find out what they actually know and what they actually think. Unfortunately, so many of us, this is not a priority. So we sort of get the elected officials we deserve because we won't do the work.
Do you know the expression, by the way? I'm sure your students have taught you what TL:(DR) means.
Mm-hmm. Too long, didn't read.
I have a feeling that's what everyone does too much of. And then it like puts you right in the hands of all kinds of bad things.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us back to what you said, literacy, not just about microbiology, a passion of mine, but in this case about politics itself. It doesn't mean you become a politician, but you actually aren't looking just at headlines or bumper stickers, but you're actually thinking critically. Yeah. By the way, that's not shorthand for agree with me.
No. I think it's amazingly easy to learn things without even trying. For me, I have the NPR radio station playing in my office all the time. So there's things sucked into my head I'm not even aware of. It's so easy to learn new things without even having to work. Watch the PBS news or the nightly news 1/2 an hour every night, and you'll know what's going on in the world. But, we amuse ourselves to death. Everybody can tell you who all the people are and the Real Housewives of wherever they are, or what Kim Kardashian is doing. Or if you spent just 1/2 an hour a day, you'd be better informed than to know where she got a Brazilian butt lift.
Thank you for that imagery.
Sorry.
As we start to close out, I thought you might want to I'm going to give the floor to you for maybe you've already talked enough about what you would like people to remember, but here's an opportunity to, again, tell people to think about your directions that you've been talking about. I'm going to be putting lots of links in the show notes to things as well.
Okay.
So the floor is yours for.
I guess I would encourage people to look at the allied health fields like medical laboratory science, especially for those of you who want to be part of the healthcare team but don't want that much patient contact. It's perfect. So if you're sort of introverted and you don't want to go out and talk to a lot of patients, this is a great place for you, especially if you like science. I always tell prospective students that if you are a good baker, you are a good chemist. And so if you're the type of person who bakes these wonderful cakes, you can be a chemist. You can. The skills are similar. If you like puzzles, especially really complicated puzzles, that's micro for you. That's blood bank for you. You are always solving a puzzle in one of those areas. So just, people tend to think I'll be a nurse. As a matter of fact, that's what my parents set me for. Because at my age, if you were a smart girl, you became a nurse. I went and became a candy striper. 2 weeks later, I'm like, I'm never going to be a nurse. Not ever. So I better find something else. So it's important to just look around. There are so many opportunities out there that you haven't heard of because you're focused on, I'm going to be a doctor, or I want to be a dentist, or, you just look at the other stuff too. And I always tell people, as an MLS, you can work through medical school. You can always have every other Saturday job that puts a little money in your pocket. The people who used to train us at the University of Maryland were medical students. They got paid for, being able to teach us how to do phlebotomy in the hospitals in the mornings. So a background in something like this never hurts. As a matter of fact, our MDs and pre-PAs, they take all the same lectures as our MLS students, just not the same labs. So that's really important type of information to pass on, that this is a career that has legs. I mean, I became an MLS, and the next thing you know, I was whispering into a senator's ear, telling him, vote this way or don't vote this way. So it has legs. It really has legs.
It's interesting to hear you say this, because when I used to work with a lot of pre-medical students, and I would try and prep them for interviews, one of the things that every prospective medical student gets asked during an interview is, why do you choose medicine? And the knee-jerk reaction is, well, I want to help people. And it's a really awful thing to say during a medical school interview, because the response is, well, there are many ways to help people.
Mm-hmm.
And you just talked about a series of careers that also help people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that a person who wants to be a physician shouldn't be. I am saying they need to think about that. And I think that's a good thing to remember. The other thing, and I don't mean to be all countercultural. There was a fella who named Carlos Castaneda, who wrote all these books during the 60s for that period of time for people who were chemically altered in their perceptions. But one of the books that he wrote had this wonderful statement from supposedly this wizard that he had met in Mexico. And it's this, that you need to find a path with heart. And the first time I heard that, it struck me like a thunderbolt what that meant. You have to find a path with heart, and you will know it when you find it. What happens is you struggle with yourself to convince yourself that's the path. If it is the path for you, you kind of know it. But did you notice what you said is you have to be open to things too?
Yeah.
And then
you have to know it's there. If you can't see the path, you can't walk the path. So
exactly so. So this has, I think, been a wonderful opportunity, Kim, and I'm so glad to hear you're still close with your family and all the wonderful times. Well, Kim, thank you so much for your time.
It's been wonderful talking to you. We should do it more often, but offline.
I've really, really enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
This has been Matters Microbial, a weekly podcast about the wonders of our microbial world and the people who study it. You can send questions, suggestions, or comments to me at mattersmicrobial@gmail.com. Show notes from today's episode, with important links, can be found at microbe.tv/mm. If you like our work, please consider supporting us at microbe.tv/contribute. I'm Doc Martin, and you can find me in the biology department at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Dr. Kimberly Walker is assistant professor and director of diagnostics at the University of Delaware. Many thanks, as always, to David Renata for superb editing and Reber Clark for the wonderfully quirky music that brings a smile to my face each week. I hope that you've enjoyed being part of our quality quorum for today. See you next time on Matters Microbial.